Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final webinar in our first ever Literacy Data Takeover Week, Beyond K-2 Assessment in the upper elementary and middle school grades. Today's webinar will be recorded and we'll email out the recording link for you to rewatch as you like. Everyone here with us today will also receive a certificate of attendance. We have a live captioner on with us today, so if you want to access the captions, just click on Live Transcript in the bottom tray. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A and we will try to get to them at the end. We also welcome comments in the chat throughout. So to start, let's find out where everyone is joining us from today and what your role in education is. Looks like some people already beat me to the punch. I am joining from Phoenix, Arizona. It is actually sunny today. And the esteemed Gina Bianca-Rosa is joining us here from Eugene, Oregon. Wonderful. We have people from all over. Hopefully many of you are experiencing pretty comfortable weather right now. Just want to let you know too, this is the very last webinar in our incredible week of webinars that we've been calling Literacy Data Takeover Week. If you missed any of them, they are there for you to watch on demand. Just go to amplify.com/data-takeover-week. You can see a quick sample or a quick view of all the webinars we've had. We've been so lucky to host Dr. Kimiana Burke, Dr. Tim Shanahan, and a couple of our Amplify friends as well. And thank you again so much for joining us here today. We were just beyond thrilled to have Dr. Gina Bianca-Rosa here. Dr. Bianca-Rosa is the Ann Swindells Chair of Education and a professor in the Department of Special Education and Clinical Sciences in the College of Education at the University of Oregon. She also retains a courtesy appointment in the Quantitative Research Methods in Education. She currently serves on the U.S. Senate and the Senate Rules Committee. She conducts her research at the Center on Teaching and Learning. Her research centers on questions related to more precise and informative measurement of reading, especially of reading comprehension and modeling of growth in reading over time. Her research has been published in top peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of Education Measurement, Educational Psychological Measurement, and Assessment for Effective Intervention. She also serves as the associate editor of the British Journal of Educational Psychology, and is on the educational boards of Educational Assessment, Elementary School Journal, and Reading Research Quarterly. And she has served as a reading, adolescent literacy, and applied measurement expert on several review panels. So as you might imagine, we are just so thrilled to have Dr. Bianca-Rosa here to talk to us. Welcome, Dr. Bianca-Rosa. We're just thrilled to have you here.
Thank you, Laura. So I'm here to talk to you all today about data for the upper elementary and middle school grades, and really thinking beyond K-2. So thank you, Laura, for the introduction. I want to point out I'm not a U.S. senator. I'm a university senator. I don't think I would survive in the U.S. Senate. But one other thing that I really wanted to highlight about my background is that I'm very involved in measure development. And so I'm one of the lead authors behind the assessments DIBELS and MOCA. And my professional background before I came into academia was as a reading specialist and an after-school teacher. So I think you'll see all of these things sort of influencing what I talk about today. So our agenda today, we're going to start with a little bit around the importance of continuing to assess reading beyond second grade. We'll talk about what data is most helpful and why. And then I'll review some of the more common reader profiles that you might see using DIBELS as an example beyond K-2, along with sort of next steps of what you might think about doing with those readers. And then my plan is to have plenty of time for questions, but we'll see how I do. So why assess beyond grade 2 or 3? Well, for one thing, learning to read does not stop. The idea that we transition from learning to read to reading to learn has pretty much been proven to be a convenient sort of, if not a myth, more of a concept of convenience rather than reality. Because in fact, learning to read continues throughout our schooling years. What we're learning to do, though, is we're moving away from learning to decode and learning how to deal with some of the more complex sort of features of the texts that we read. So for one thing, we might be dealing with, or we will be dealing with increasingly complex syntax, increasingly rare vocabulary, and an increasingly broad range of styles and genres, text types. And along with these sort of increasing demands that our texts are making of readers, we also have increasing expectations sort of pedagogically of our students. So we're expecting them to read with more and more independence, with less assistance from us. We are expecting them to be able to read to learn. So in our content areas, we become more and more dependent on students being able to read their textbooks independently. And then we also have rising expectations that our students will be able to synthesize information that they draw from across multiple texts. So all of these things mean that learning to read really does not stop once we've learned to decode. So I thought I would just give you a few examples just around syntax so that you can appreciate what we're really asking of our readers. So passive voice sentences, it turns out, are not something that our young readers automatically understand. In fact, the majority of students who are around 7.5 to 8 years old don't comprehend as well a sentence like "the moon was jumped over by the cow." So they're much more used to and accomplished at "the cow jumped over the moon." And it's especially confusing when the content of the passive voice sentence is unexpected. So when we say the dog was chased by the cat, it can cause even more of a hesitation and need to kind of process, okay, what's really happening here? Along with that, we see increasing use of dependent clauses across the intermediate and middle and high school grades. So dependent clauses are simply, as you probably know, clauses that cannot appear alone. So we would never say "because the speaker was brilliant" as a sentence. We might in oral speech, but not in writing. So these lead to increasingly long sentences, and it's particularly difficult for young readers when the dependent clause is the first thing that comes in the sentence. So they become very used to subject, verb, object kind of organization or syntax. And as we depart from that, it becomes more challenging for our young readers to comprehend. So we have to give them some guideposts and help them learn how to handle these kinds of challenges in syntax. So embedded relative clauses are even more challenging for our young readers. These are dependent clauses like "that people allow to roam outside freely" that appear right in between the subject and verb or verb and object. And they make the comprehension process that much more complicated because they're interrupting that expected order. And we can have even more complex syntax. I'm always tempted to share a sentence from George Eliot at this point, but that would take up the entire slide. She is renowned for writing very, very long and syntactically complex sentences. So this is just one that I wrote back when Wayward Pines came out. So as you can see, locating where is the actual main subject and verb in here is difficult. And the idea here is that facility with complex syntax does not develop instantaneously or over the course of a single grade. It develops continuously and slowly across the schooling years. And again, this is just one example of the way that our readers are continuing to learn to read across the grades beyond K-2. Because challenges continue to increase, we find that reading difficulties can emerge late, if you will, that readers who seemed like they were doing perfectly fine in the early elementary grades will suddenly start to show difficulties that we would not have predicted. One of these types of readers are what we call, or what I call, sight word or bootstrap readers. They're really strong comprehenders who appear fluent in the early grades. And I call them bootstrap readers because they're really using their strong comprehension skills in order to kind of make up for their lack of decoding skills. So they really only tend to come to our notice once text complexity exceeds their sight word vocabulary, the words that they have memorized, which we as readers can memorize up to 3,000 or so words simply by sight, as well as their ability to predict or guess words. And this is really what starts to fail them as they get into fourth grade, fifth grade, and beyond. Another type of reader who emerges late is a word caller. And this is an old-fashioned name for a reader who is highly fluent, and they're great at decoding, but they don't comprehend as well as we might expect based on their decoding skills. And this really only becomes evident when the text messages become more complex. Right. So the texts that we have our readers reading in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and even third grade tend to be relatively easier to comprehend, if you will, than the more demanding texts that we start exposing our readers to in the grades beyond those. And so as the texts become more complex and the comprehension demands and expectations increase, these readers start to become more evident. So these are readers that will want to sort of detect when we're assessing beyond K2. So what data would we want to be looking at and why beyond those grades? Well, it's most critical to assess on fluency. As most of you probably know, oral reading fluency is one of the strongest indicators we have of overall reading health, if you will. But it's also important to assess on comprehension. Obviously, comprehension is the end goal of reading. It's the whole reason that we read. So we need to assess on that as well as fluency, particularly to pick up on those word callers. So universal screening in these areas can help reveal weaknesses in student skills. And it might seem like having only 2 assessments won't give you a lot of data, but what I'm going to be illustrating for you is that a lot can be inferred from just 2 data points. And I want to acknowledge that there are many screening test options out there for universal screening, but I'm going to talk about the one that I'm most familiar with, which is the one that I helped to author, which is Dibble's 8th edition. So Dibble's 8th edition is available across kindergarten through grade 8. And you can see here the various subtests that we have on the measure. I'm going to be focusing on the subtests that are available beyond grade 2. So as you'll see in grades 4 through 8, we have oral reading fluency, which yields 2 scores, a correct words per minute or reading rate score, and an accuracy score, the percent of words read correctly out of all words attempted. And then we also have a basic comprehension assessment called MAZE. And this assessment yields 1 score, which gives you a sense of how well a student is comprehending, just a brief indicator, so it doesn't get into depth of comprehension. And then in 3rd grade, we have 2 additional subtests, which I will also be talking about, which are nonsense word fluency, the reading of made-up words that are phonically regular, so decodable, and word reading fluency, which is a measure of sight word reading ability. So here you can see sort of a class level snapshot. It's very typical to use the composite score in particular in order to determine how many students we have who are at benchmark or above benchmark, below benchmark, or well below benchmark, so that we can determine which students really need intensive supports, who might need strategic support, and who's good with the core or beyond. And you can see I've got a small class here, only 6 students. At a high level, we can also summarize across the subtests in this way. But what I'm going to really focus on is taking a deeper dive and looking at sort of the constellation of performance that individual students have, because that's really where we start to be able to inform instructional decisions, not just around the level of support that a student needs, but where they might benefit from some more, specifically from some more support. So here we have an example, and I'm showing screenshots from the M-Class data system, which just has a nice reporting out of these things. But the DIBELS data system has this, and I've seen people come up with their own spreadsheets that give them this information as well. So here we have the class details, where we have how each of the students is doing on the composite, ORF accuracy, ORF words correct per minute, and the Maze basic comprehension score. And as you can see, there's kind of a quilt here. So things become a lot more complicated than simply what the composite score tells us. So we can have scores or composite scores where all the subtests agree with what that composite score is telling us. But we can also have composite scores where the subtest might be giving us different messages about a student's strengths and weaknesses. And so what I'm going to be doing is taking you through some common reader profiles that we can see in these subtest class level subtest scores, and what their implications are for instruction and why it's so valuable to look deeper than the composite score. So here we have Teresa, and she is an above, and I should say these are all made up names. She's an above benchmark reader. So she's at negligible risk. This is an example of a reader who is above benchmark on everything. The only thing she's not above benchmark on is at ORF accuracy, and that's because we don't have an above benchmark level there. If we did, she would be there. And so one thing I want to emphasize about readers like Teresa, folks will often email in and ask, how do I set growth goals for a reader like Teresa on DIBELS? And what I say back to folks who ask that question is that faster is not always better. Teresa is basically not showing any signs of risk. And so rather than trying to get her to read the oral reading fluency passages faster, or to get even more items correct on the Maze measure, I would turn to other aspects of the curriculum. So I'd focus more potentially on enrichment, giving Teresa potentially above grade level text so that she continues to challenge her decoding skills, and encourage her to do wide reading, to build her background knowledge. Because really what we see here is that Teresa has those kind of foundational skills well mastered. And so continued work on them is really a little bit of wasted time for her. So here we have Darla, and Darla is another reader where her composite score agrees with all of her subtest scores. She is below benchmark, or well below benchmark, on all 3 of the scores that we have available for her. So the first question that I ask about a reader like Darla is, okay, we know she's well below benchmark and she's going to need intensive support, but is she performing below the 10th percentile rank? So why do I ask that question? Why is that so important? If she's below the 10th percentile rank for her grade level, we're going to go off grade level with her to figure out what measures we want to use to progress monitor her with. If she's not below that 10th percentile rank, then I'm going to progress monitor her with grade level forms. And so as it turns out, Teresa is below the 10th percentile on both of the ORF measures. She's actually above the 10th percentile on Maze, but really just barely. So what I'm going to do with her then is to take her down to, remember she's a fourth grader. I'm going to take her down to grade 3 forms in order to figure out where she's at and where I want to start my intervention with her and where I want to progress monitor her. So off-grade testing with ORF is recommended in these grades beyond grade 2 for students who are performing below the 10th percentile on one or more measures. I want to emphasize that we always do our benchmark assessment with grade level forms. So for Darla, when it comes to the next time of year to benchmark her, I'm going to go back to the grade level forms, the fourth grade forms. But I will follow up with off-grade forms to ascertain sort of her correct level of intervention and progress monitoring. So the question that I ask there is, does the student perform below the 10th percentile on the grade level immediately below their own? If yes, I'm going to go down even another grade level and repeat the process until I find where they're performing above the 10th percentile. Because what we don't want to do is continue to give our most vulnerable readers texts that are inordinately challenging and are going to cause them an undue amount of frustration and cause them to shut down likely. Once they're performing above the 10th percentile on an off-grade level form, then I have found my magic level that I'm going to start working with them on. And I'm going to progress monitor with those grade level forms going forward. So one important piece of information, though, is people often want to know, when do we go back up a grade level? And we'll do that once Darla is at or above grade level for the target measure at that grade level. So we're trying to get her to the benchmark level at the end of the year for the grade level at which she's being assessed. And once she accomplishes that, we go back up a grade. So once the ORF level is determined, you might also consider additional subtests at the same grade level. So with Darla, we went down to 3rd grade. And remember, in 3rd grade, we also have available nonsense word fluency and word reading fluency. And if the student is performing well below benchmark on the target measure, then it's a good idea to go ahead and administer those measures as well, because they'll give us a little bit more information about her component skills. And this is also how we're going to be able to determine how strong her decoding skills are and her sight word knowledge. So if both assessments are at or above benchmark, we're going to progress monitor with ORF. Her challenge really is fluency. But if she's below or well below benchmark with one of these measures, then we're probably going to be focusing, it's most likely going to be nonsense word fluency, and we'll focus on decoding skills at that grade level and progress monitor with NWF or nonsense word fluency at that grade level. Just like with ORF, if she's performing below the 10th percentile, I can always go down a grade level to see how she's doing with the 2nd grade level forms or even the 1st grade level forms. And the idea is this is going to allow us to target our intervention right at this level that she's going to benefit most, and to do our progress monitoring where with measures that are most likely to show growth when she has it. So that's if both NWF and WRF agree. But what happens when they disagree? So WRF, if that's at benchmark, but NWF is not, what you have is potentially a sight word reader. So one of these readers, again, who has memorized a lot of words, the most common words in the English language that appear in print, but they're not decoding. And so that's a reader whom we would work on decoding with and progress monitor with NWF. So the same as we would do if both NWF and WRF agree. But if NWF is at benchmark and word reading fluency is not, what we have here is a potential word caller, someone who has really strong decoding skills, but who's not really working on reading for meaning. So they have maybe gotten the message that reading is simply about decoding and reading as fast as we can. And they've missed the point that reading is for getting the message that the author is trying to convey, to build meaning ourselves from the text that we read. And so in this case, we're going to really want to work with this reader on reading for meaning and progress monitor them with oral reading fluency. And again, if either of these are at or below the 10th percentile, this is starting to be a refrain, I hope you've noticed, we'll assess at a lower grade level to kind of, again, find that sweet spot for them for both intervention and progress monitoring. So let's move on now to Eva. Eva is an above benchmark reader, but it turns out if we take a glance at her performance on the subtests, we'll notice that she's actually below benchmark in ORF accuracy. So while I'm not super concerned about Eva because she is above benchmark on her composite score, I might want to be keeping an eye on her because she might be a sight word reader. And what I mean by this is that she may be one of these readers whose sight word reading skills are really, really strong, and she's really good at predicting what words are coming next based on the meaning in the passage. But those skills, while they can get you very far through third and even fourth grade, they start to fail us in about fourth and fifth grade. And so with a reader like that, I might just want to follow up with a decoding measure. So with the grade 3 nonsense word fluency. And if it turns out that she is at or above benchmark on that measure, then likely what's happening is she's just trying to read really fast. And she's sacrificing accuracy in pursuit of a faster reading rate. So I might, at that point, encourage Eva, slow down a little bit. It's not just about getting as fast as we can. We also want to be accurate because we want to make sure that we're really accurately receiving the message. But if she's below benchmark on the grade 3 nonsense word fluency measure, then we're going to want to work on decoding with her because it's turning out she probably is one of these word callers or sight word readers. So we do, look for flags like this, particularly on ORF accuracy, even when a reader is at or above benchmark. It allows us to differentiate our instruction for readers like Eva. I also wanted to just note that word callers, these are our fast and accurate decoders, can show up with at or above benchmark accuracy and fluency, but below benchmark maze. So when they might be in the green or the blue on both ORF measures, but in the yellow or even the red on maze. And that kind of a reader, I don't have an example of that reader, but that reader is one where I would very much want to make sure that they are reading for meaning and to follow up with NWF in that case as well to make sure that their decoding skills are strong. So our last two readers here that I want to emphasize are Jennifer and Walter. And they actually have the same pattern of results. They're incredibly accurate, which is fantastic. So we know that they've got their decoding skills in place, but they are below benchmark in terms of their oral reading fluency. And in this case, well below benchmark in comprehension. And what that tells me is that they really need to work on their fluency. So they've got the decoding skills, but they're not as automatic as we want them to be. And so these readers, we're going to be focusing on automaticity and giving them lots of experience with reading texts and building meaning from those texts. So if they are, one thing that we might want to do just to kind of see if there are some weak decoding skills, you're probably getting the message at this point that using that grade 3 nonsense word fluency measure can be a nice diagnostic touch. So you could do that in this case. I think these are really strong candidates for simply working on fluency. But if you're at all concerned that their decoding skills aren't as strong as they might be, the grade 3 nonsense word fluency measure is going to be the one that will give you that more diagnostic information. And these decision points are really what we've been seeing all along. They're at or above benchmark. Will do what my first instinct was, work on fluency. If they're below benchmark, they might need a little bit of grade level decoding work. And I emphasize grade level, not going back to the beginning, but really working with more complex decoding patterns, advanced phonics. And if they're below the 10th percentile, now I've got some alarm bells going off and I want to go down again and see where do their decoding skills kind of leave off. Okay, so putting it all together, a majority of screening systems offer measures just like DIBELS does, oral reading fluency and some sort of basic comprehension measure. And I hope what you've learned at this point is that even with just 2 measures, there's a lot of information that we can glean from those measures. And they can give us pointers both as to what's most appropriate instructionally, as well as where we might want to go next with assessment in order to drill down a little bit deeper into their skills. So when we have very strong performance across the board, it suggests that more fluency work is probably unnecessary. And this is especially so for those students who are well above benchmark. If they have very poor performance across the board, most of the time, this is going to merit further assessment so that we can figure out sort of where their skill sets sort of leave off and just determine that what I was calling the sweet spot for intervention and for progress monitoring. And we also want to be keeping an eye out for late emerging reading difficulties, readers who have kind of unexpected sort of patterns of performance on the subtests, given how they performed on the composite score. So remember that our word callers are readers who are very fluent, but they're not doing well on those basic comprehension measures. And so that's a sign that we need to work on reasserting with them that, hey, we're reading because there's meaning here. And this is the point of what we're doing. And then, of course, there are our sight word readers, those readers who have used sort of their strong memory for word forms and their strong comprehension skills in order to bootstrap their weak decoding skills. And they show up as fluent readers until those grade level texts begin to exceed their sight word vocabularies. So right when we get to 3rd, 4th, 5th grade is when they start to show up. And then finally, I hope another sort of message that you got from what I've been talking about is that we always want to progress monitor with the measure that's most closely aligned to the intervention that we're delivering and that is at the grade level of the skills at which we are delivering that intervention. So that's all I have. This is a beautiful view of the Willamette Valley where I am right now, and it's about as hazy as it looks here, although the sun is up. So thank you very much for your attention, and we can turn now to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bianca Rosa. And we have tons of questions. People are just hungry for this information. So everyone, I know you've been putting some questions in the chat, so please be sure to put them in the Q&A so we can keep better track of them and we'll get through what we can here. So we had a couple questions about some of the information, like some of the specific information you presented. So let me find one here. Sorry, there's a lot. Oh, you know what? Dan asked, benchmark at any given grade is equal to what percentile? Do you have an answer for that?
That is a great question. So we do not set our benchmark goals using percentile ranks. We paid attention to percentile ranks when we were setting them, but that's not what drives that decision. It is driven statistically. So it's what we call criterion referencing. So the benchmark goals are determined by statistically predicting to the whether a student performs at or above the 40th percent or the 40th percentile on a third-party measure of reading achievement. So in the case of Dibble's 8th edition, we used the Iowa test of reading, which is a very well-respected measure. And so benchmark is really the line at which we're relatively certain they're going to perform at about average or above. That I want to emphasize that the below benchmark line, the one that puts a student in the red, as we often talk about it casually, is actually predicting to the 20th percentile rank. So at that point, if a student is performing in the red, we know they're highly likely to be in the bottom fifth of performance for their grade level by the end of the year. It's an important distinction to understand that the benchmark goals are based on this criterion referencing, and that percentile ranks are what we call norm referencing. So that simply tells you how well a student is performing relative to their peers at that particular time of year.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Sure.
We have a couple questions too about supporting students with additional needs. So Anna, and I believe someone else asked if there's research about the validity of DIBELS for English learners at different proficiency levels.
There is, this research has largely been conducted by third-party individuals, and it is surprisingly accurate. I think one of the things that is complicated when we're dealing with our English learners, however, is that we don't want to start setting off alarm bells that a student who is only at level 1 or 2, let's say, on an English language proficiency measure, is at risk for dyslexia because they're below benchmark on DIBELS, because we know that they haven't gained proficiency in the English language yet. So really, what we always emphasize when talking about English language learners and DIBELS is paying attention to both data points. So it's much more concerning if you have a student who's at level 4 or level 5 on an English language proficiency measure, but is below benchmark on DIBELS. That's when my alarm bells start going off. So I would never recommend looking at DIBELS alone and making decisions based on DIBELS alone in that case.
Thank you. And I do want to just take a moment to state that we actually offer for Spanish-speaking students, M-Class Lectura works nicely with M-Class or DIBELS to assess Spanish-speaking students' literacy growth and English language development. So if your students are primarily speaking Spanish, that might be something worth looking into. We can share some info in the chat about that as well.
Yeah, Laura, I'm just going to follow up on that and actually say that my colleague, Dr. Patrick Kennedy, and a student of ours, Joe Ermita, are working on an analysis looking at both DIBELS and Lectura data and trying to define profiles of performance and risk, if you will, based on that data. And it's been really insightful because, as you might imagine, you find students who do well across the board, who don't do well across the board, but you also have these mixed profiles where students are doing really great in Spanish, but not as well in English. And and vice versa. And we're a lot less worried about students like that as long as they're doing well in one language or the other. Really can't emphasize enough that if a student is being instructed to read in Spanish or has reading knowledge in Spanish, gaining that additional information will help you make more valid decisions about really what the student needs instructionally.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. News to my
Yeah.
ear, too. Tara has asked about students with attention processing and working memory deficits. She says, I find that they read more accurately when taught to slow down and be careful readers. Using tools, many times I have students who score at or above the benchmark for accuracy, but significantly at risk for rate. This can be confusing, especially in terms of reporting to parents, jurisdictions, but also in planning. Is there anything you can speak to about that?
Yeah. So, yeah, the thing that I would emphasize with parents there is that, Dibbles is obviously a speeded measure. And if this is a skill set that we know that a given student struggles with, those results are to be expected. And so they're not cause for alarm in the same way, right? So many students have an accommodation where they're allowed more time on high stakes measures. So what I would emphasize with parents is that, Dibbles is a low stakes measure. It's really just intended to screen for difficulties. And when you have a student who's highly accurate, which is always, the first thing we want, but is not as fast as would indicate as the benchmark goals are sort of setting out for them. That's not an unexpected piece of information. And so it's only reinforcing that, yeah, this is an area of struggle for this particular student. But that doesn't mean that, I always go to fire alarms, and we don't have a 3-alarm fire there because we're already cognizant of this challenge. And there's if this is a student who has a processing speed difficulty, that's just not an expectation that we're going to hold for them, that we're ever going to get them specifically to benchmark on that measure. That said, we still want them to comprehend at grade level. And so we're going to look to other measures, particularly state test measures, right, where they're not timed. And so when they have that accommodation in place, we want them to perform at grade level or hopefully above. So I hope that answers your question. I would just sort of downplay that as cause for alarm because it's something that we're already aware of.
Thank you. Julie has said our district wants to go to only screening those they feel are at risk or are new in 4th and 5th grades. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so the benefits of universal screening are pretty well known. I would caution them against that. I do think that, once you get into 4th and 5th grade, that that for students who are performing well above benchmark, the benefit of repeated screening at middle and end of year is not as great, right? It's not as necessary as it is for students who may be closer to that benchmark line or definitely below that benchmark line. There is some pressure in the field as well as in our society to test less. But the thing about universal screening is it's designed to be quick, right? And so we're not talking about using up an entire class period in order to get just a quick pulse on how this reader is doing. And the thing that I would say that screening gives you at the beginning of the year in particular, that a state test from the previous year doesn't give you, is how this reader is doing with grade level texts and how we would predict they would do by the end of the year with grade level texts. So I would appeal to their I would mention those factors and try to get them to reconsider that decision.
Thank you. Next, we have Alice, who said, we were talking about, this must have been something you said a couple minutes ago. We were talking about this yesterday in a grade level meeting. Is it common for a student to perform well in the phonemic awareness section and low in other areas like letters and sounds?
Yeah, that can totally happen. Because phonemic awareness, at least the way that we assess it with DIBELS, it's purely oral, right? And so it's a whole additional challenge once you start having to deal with letter sound correspondence. So it is not unusual to have a student who does well on phonemic segmentation, but does not do well on nonsense word fluency or oral reading fluency. So, that's not atypical.
Okay,
Was that what she was asking, or yeah, I just want to make sure I actually answered the question.
you know what, I lost the question, but if that was not, oh, here it is. Is it common for a student to perform well in the phonemic awareness section and low in other letters and sounds?
Okay, yeah.
Wonderful. Let me see, I lost my spot here. Okay, Shelley has said, I wanted more information about the nonsense word fluency on DIBELS. Are there two components of that particular test that are scored? One for individual sounds for each nonsense word and two for whole word reading? And does a student have to do both to get the maximum score? For example, what if a child only reads the sounds in first grade and not the word? How is this scored? Is it lower?
Great question. And I had meant to mention that. So the nonsense word fluency measure, let me just kind of backtrack and kind of give you guys an orientation to it. So it's measuring decoding skills using made up words. And in the past, DIBELS only assessed this with CVC, consonant, vowel, consonant words. And vowel consonant words. But now it goes all the way up through third grade, and we get into more advanced phonic patterns. So we include vowel digraphs, we include consonant digraphs and blends. We even get into two-syllable words. And so the complexity of the measure goes up across the grades. So that's why the grade 3 measure, we recommend, if they're doing really poorly with that, go down to the grade 2 where you'll get more information with second grade level words. Now that I've said that, all of the nonsense word fluency measures yield 2 scores. So we score them both on correct letter sounds. So with a word like dat, D-A-T, if they said d-at, they would get 3 correct letter sounds. But on the second score, which is words recoded correctly, they would get a 0 because they didn't blend. Now, if they said dat right away, they would get 3 correct letter sounds and 1 word correctly recoded. And so it's possible to do better on the correct letter sounds measure than on the words recoded correctly measure. But if they're recoding and blending like that, they'll always do just as well on both scores. So then the question is really, what about the student who is doing that first example that I gave, where they're decoding sound by sound, but they're not blending? And a student like that is going to do really well in correct letter sounds, but not really well on the words recoded correctly. And what that tells me about them is that maybe they're not aware that they can and should be blending. The overall weight that these measures get, though, in our composite score, the correct letter sounds measure gets a lot more weight than the words recoded correctly. And that's simply because that is a skill that really differentiates our better and poorer readers more successfully than the words recoded correctly measure does.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, lots more. Shira asks, how do you recommend that educators use the data from DIBELS in conjunction with their curriculum embedded assessments?
That's a great question. So for me, the curriculum embedded assessments tell me about how a student is doing with a particular unit or lesson, if you will, and less about sort of their global skills. Whereas Dibbles is really intended as one of those sort of global measures. So trying to think of a sort of a medical metaphor here, if you will. It's sort of like Dibbles is like when you go into the doctor's office and they take your blood pressure and they measure your height and your weight. These are all just very sort of quick indicators of your overall health. And that's really what Dibbles is about. And we're looking for sort of alarm signs, if you will, or red flags. And I would think of a curriculum based or like a curriculum embedded measure as being sort of more like the height and weight charts that we use in the doctor's office with our children, where we're not just getting the overall measure and saying, okay, that's how tall you are, that's how heavy you are. We're actually looking at, given your age, where are you in terms of where the norms for a given age. This is probably not a great example because curriculum embedded measures aren't norm referenced, but I think of it more as sort of you have learning goals that are embedded within your curriculum, and those measures are telling you how well students are meeting those specific goals. And so they're really distinct things that are getting at distinct aspects of a child's learning journey. So I don't know if that's a really satisfying answer for you, but I'd have to know a lot more about the curriculum and the measures themselves to say how I might use that, coordinate across them. It's a little difficult to answer in a general way.
Well, thank you for trying. It made sense to me. Lauren has said, in our district, we have to show a 2-year gap in order to recommend for further evaluation. Therefore, we use off-grade level progress monitoring with all of our tier students. I'm not sure how to progress monitor on grade level and still show this gap. What do you recommend?
Yeah, so I'm not necessarily recommending, I definitely wasn't recommending always progress monitoring on grade level. We have decision rules for going off grade level. It sounds like from your context, I might be a little more generous with that 10th percentile rule than I mean, it's a guidepost that we give folks in terms of like that's a point at which I would definitely go off grade and go down a grade. But it might be that you want to do that with all of your well below benchmark students. A lot of this is about capacity though, right? And so if you have a lot of students who are well below benchmark, going off grade level with all of them might not be feasible. So that's really why we have that 10th percentile recommendation. I would call it a recommendation rather than a rule. So yeah, I think given your context, and if you have a student who you think should be recommended for further testing, and then I would definitely go off grade level at them and see how they're doing. Because if they're not able to hit benchmark, if you've gone down 2 grade levels and they're not able to hit benchmark, that's a pretty good sign to me that they're 2 years behind. It's not exactly what Dibbles was designed to do, but it's evidence that I think a school psychologist would take seriously, and might help to make that decision for further testing.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions, so I want to choose a little bit carefully. Meredith has asked, is Dibbles appropriate as a high stakes measure as it is being used in some places?
No. It makes me very unhappy that it's used in that manner. We try to be as clear as possible in our administration and scoring materials and our, particularly our technical manual, that it was not designed as a high stakes measure, nor should it be used as such. Unfortunately, as a measure developer, you can never control how someone goes about using your measure. You can only make recommendations. And yeah, so no.
Thank you. Nice and clear. From Christy, we have seen a big drop in our fourth graders' scores from middle of year to bottom of year or, excuse me, beginning of year or. What do we do about this and why would that be happening?
Wait, you saw a drop from beginning of year to middle of year?
I'm guessing she meant end of year.
I'm guessing but it's not end of year yet. So what we see in fourth grade is that the middle of year passage is a great deal easier than the beginning or end of year passage. And people get really worried about that, but it's actually not an issue because of the way that we conducted the validation studies. So when we drew the benchmark goals, again, we're predicting to this end of year third party measure. And so the fact that everybody's using that same passage, those benchmark goals at any given time of year are specific to that passage. And so that's why you can sometimes see, I've also heard questions about in third grade, the bottom of above benchmark is a little bit lower at the end of the year than it is at the beginning or the middle of the year. And those kinds of things can happen just because we're dealing with passages. And it's impossible to create a completely equivalent passage. The only way to do it is to give someone the exact same passage. So when we read texts, they're meaning driven, right? So that perfect equivalency is not possible. So we're looking less at the exact score and more at how are they performing in terms of benchmark goals? And then also, how are they performing in terms of percentile ranks? So I would be much more concerned if a student was performing, let's say, at the 50th percentile rank and then dropped to the 40th. That to me is much more concerning than if they were reading, let's say, 120 words per minute at one time of year, and at the next time of year, they were reading 115 words per minute. The percentile ranks are really what are telling you how they're doing relative to grade level peers. And the benchmark categorization is telling you how they're doing relative to grade level expectations. So I hope that helps.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. So Cynthia has asked, what if a student is passing state tests but well below on DIBELS?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I feel like that plays into that earlier question we had around processing speed. Obviously, DIBELS is a speeded measure. And so if you have a student who does not do well with speeded measures, timed measures, then they're going to do less well on DIBELS. And of course, we have accommodations that we give on state tests that we don't necessarily give on a measure like DIBELS. So it would depend on how big the discrepancy is. So for example, you could have a student who just made it to grade level. One of the issues with both DIBELS and state tests is that we use cut scores. And cut scores are always, to some extent, arbitrary, which is a horrible word to have to say, right? Because it makes it sound like we're flipping coins here, but we're really not. We're doing the best that the statistics will allow us to do on DIBELS. And when it comes to state tests, we're doing that with sort of benchmark setting. And the idea, though, is that a student can be just above or just below those cuts. And a student who is just above a cut and just below a cut are not very different from each other. And so if this is a student who's sort of just below benchmark on ORF and just above grade level on the state test, I'd say they're doing about how I'd expect, and vice versa. But if they're doing like, well above grade level on the state test, but well below grade level on DIBELS, I'd want to know if there's a processing speed issue here, and if it's the speeded nature of DIBELS that is tripping them up. And if that's the case, I'm less concerned about that student. Another thing that can happen also, particularly with older readers, is they sometimes, as we know, become disaffected, right? And so one thing that I always like to remind teachers about is if you're assessing a student and you know that they're having a god-awful day. I've seen 7th graders who just sit there and won't read at all, right? And I've seen teachers give them a score of 0. That's not what we should be doing with that student. We should actually be spoiling that assessment and saying, we'll assess you on a day when you're actually willing to engage in the task. So that's another question I would ask, is to what degree were they really giving it their all on DIBELS? Because if they weren't, then I would retest on another day and see how they do.
Thank you. Thanks for ending on that note for us. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and a huge thank you to Dr. Bianca Rosa for being here with us today for both the presentation and taking so much time to answer questions. We are really sorry we couldn't get to them all, but you guys had so many. This was an incredible presentation. Thank you so much. I just want to remind you all, as we're 1 minute over the hour, that there are 5 other webinars in this series. If you missed them, just go ahead and go to amplify.com/data takeover week, where you can register and see the recordings. We will be following up with an email with a link to this recording and also to Dr. Bianca Rosa's presentation deck. Thank you all so much for joining us for our first ever Literacy Data Takeover Week, and have a wonderful weekend.
Bye-bye. Thank you.